Ibrahima, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Ed.
Okay, I need you to give me authority to share the screen.
Sure. Go ahead, Ed.
Okay. All right, when is the certificate now up?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Beautiful.
This is from 1935 again, and as I said, John Dewey was the school's first honorary president. Henry George's daughter, Anna, who had married a member of the famous DeMille family, William DeMille, is the president of the school. And at that particular time, it was signed by the instructor, Julian Hickok, who later becomes the director of the Philadelphia extension of the Henry George School. I forget exactly what year. But anyway, what's happening with the school begins to change too, because when the school's founder, Oscar Geiger, dies, the school has to find a new director. And one of the activists who's in New York at the time was a man named Frank Chodoroff. And he was chosen he had been teaching, and so he's chosen to be the new director. Well, Chodoroff is a staunch individualist. He's both anti-monopoly and anti-statist. And so he takes over as director of the school with this emphasis on Henry George's individualism. And the school begins to blossom. Extensions and affiliated schools are spread across the United States and into Canada. And in New York, the school develops course materials to emphasize George's individualism as the right path to forming just societies. So versions of these teaching materials are then provided to the schools that are opening, not just all around the United States and Canada, but in other countries as well. Here's a picture of John Dewey. So Dewey is pretty much involved. He will speak about Henry George from time to time at events at the school. And Dewey is also trying to bring his analysis of the economy in the 1930s to the public's attention. Again, based on what Henry George had to say. Dewey writes a paper in 1931 to talk about the growing problem of unemployment. And in that paper, here's what he says. Unemployment is not only recurrent, but chronic. There exists all the time what is known as normal unemployment. Our industrial system is speeded up beyond its power to stand the racking that comes from its own movement. Such a crisis as the present calls attention in a dramatic, even a sensational way to something that exists all the time, but which under ordinary circumstances, most men are too blind to observe. One could even, listening to him, it sounds almost as though that could be coming out of someone who had a very strong socialistic stance on the cause of the Depression. So there's this crossover of thinking that I see constantly between the socialists and the followers of Henry George. But then just a year later, Dewey went on the radio to give a broadcast about the Depression. And his message was, go to the work of Henry George himself and learn how many of the troubles from which society still suffers and suffers increasingly are due to the fact that a few have monopolized the land, and that in consequence, they have the power to dictate to others access to the land and to its products, which include water power, electricity, coal, iron, and all minerals, as well as the foods that sustain life. And he finishes up by saying, and that they have the power to appropriate to their private use the values that the industry, the civilized order, the very benefactions of others produce. This wrong is at the very basis of our present social and economic chaos. And until it is righted, all steps toward economic recovery may be temporarily helpful, while in the long run useless. It's a pretty strong statement coming from Dewey, and he's not, I don't think, well recognized as a staunch supporter of Henry George's ideas. And obviously, hardly anyone was even listening to him, someone with his stature as a well-known educator in the United States. But in the February 1939 issue of Land and Liberty, again, which was published out of London, Francis C.R. Douglas, a solicitor and also a strong supporter of the single tax movement in Scotland, reminded readers that Marx, again in the third volume of Capital, seemed to echo what Henry George would later write. Douglas says, "It appears that Marx considers that every form of exploitation is based not merely historically, but as a living fact upon land monopoly. This is not a mere chance remark, for the same thing is said over and over again. It is a pity that most of Marx's followers know so little of the contents of these chapters. If they had, they might have appreciated why the first demand of the Communist Manifesto was abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes." So there's another just reminder to socialists, hey, your intellectual giant of the movement believed very much the same as did Henry George with regard to the land question. And yet most socialists just simply ignored it. Well, at the school, there's another prominent personality that arises to bring the message of individualism to his classroom and to a larger audience. In 1938, he begins his studies at the school. His name is Jacob Schwartzman. He was a young attorney in New York City. He and his family had escaped from state socialism that had really consumed his homeland. He was born in the Ukraine, so his family left to escape the communist regime, and he came to the United States, became an attorney, as well as eventually a professor of literature at Nassau Community College in New York. So Schwartzman wholeheartedly embraced the principles of individualism, as did Frank Shotteroff, and they brought this perspective to the Henry George community, and again, particularly concentrated in New York, but as well as to the larger community. So after Jack, most of his friends called him Jack, not Jacob. After completing the school's program, he became a member of the faculty. He became one of the movement's prolific writers and effective teachers. And that same year, which was 1940, he began writing a series of articles taking on some of those who had unfairly, in his view, criticized Henry George. In the March-April 1942 issue of Land and Freedom, he took on the socialist critics directly. First on his list was the Reverend F.M. Sprague, who was the author of a work titled Socialism and Genesis to Revelation that came out in 1893. He then examined what Norman Thomas wrote in his 1934 book titled The Choice Before Us. Jack essentially pointed to the misrepresentations of what Henry George actually wrote and what Georgists, as they were now being referred to, generally believed and embraced as essential to political economy as a method of scientific investigation. He also offered facts to counter to many socialist claims. Just one example, he wrote, "Nor is it true that there is no available land that can be had for nothing. According to League of Nations statistics, the world is very thinly populated at a density of only 38.4 persons per square mile. While the best lands have been appropriated through private ownership, there are vast stretches of unused and unclaimed soil on this earth, and water, being part of land in the economic sense, constitutes in many parts of the world a margin of production. A margin of production, as the political economist looked at it, really is best expressed by this chart. It's pretty simple, but it's used in this way to refer to that part of nature, the use of which yields no rent. All that could be produced rightfully belong to its producer as wages, whether they use the tools or simply their hands. So Jack's basically challenging this idea that there's no longer any access to free land, that there's much land that still is out there for free and can be developed. He goes on to say, capital does not exploit labor, since it cannot fix labor's wages. The latter is determined by the margin. The fact that capitalists and laborers fight one another does not any more prove natural antagonism than does the fact that laborers fight amongst themselves prove that labor exploits labor. Blind and fruitless hatreds are the natural results of a sick and poverty-stricken world. And that's certainly consistent with Henry George's thought in his writings about what would happen if societies actually began to collect the rent and cease to tax economic production, that there'd be much less stress in societies, much less inclination for people to engage in criminal activities or antisocial behavior, that the level of cooperation would become much more prominent over extreme competition or aggression, of people toward one another. Now, again, Shadorov, Schwartzman, and others associated with the Henry George movement are emphasizing this anti-statist belief that we don't need this huge amount of government intervention in society to achieve justice or equitable outcomes. And in fact, that it can be counterproductive. That the problem with that, in their view, is the more that we give up in terms of individual liberty in order to secure security, the less likely it is we'll have either liberty or security. And so finding this balance, what's the proper role of government in society? How much should government intervene, and what should our systems of law, public policy, and taxation be? They took it to almost a neo-libertarian level within the Georgist community. Now, on the continent, Henry George's analysis found only scattered and really inconsistent advocacy. One German professor of economics and sociology, pictured here, Franz Oppenheimer, arrived in the United States in 1938. And just a few years later, he had become one of the co-founders of the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, which from its inception encouraged scholarly analysis of Henry George's system of political economy. Oppenheimer wrote an article titled "Scientific Communism Disproved" in 1943 that appeared in another publication titled "The Freedom." And here's what he had to say about it. And again, he's coming from a Europe that is battling between fascism and communism and socialism. The system that of cooperative individualism that would have come into being with if Henry George's ideas had really become prominent is hardly in the mix. And he says, about socialism. Utopian socialism rested on the assumption that society is a mechanism, a badly constructed contraption which must be repaired or replaced by an entirely new kind of machine. Marx knew this to be wrong. He had imbibed Hegel's conception of society as an organism grown and developed according to natural law in the dialectics of evolution, but not shaped by dictum of a political wizard. And he has a couple more things to say before I go on. He says, a new society could not be constructed. It could come into being only through organic development out of the capitalist order. Socialists could alleviate and accelerate the birth of a new order. They could not build it like a machine. And finally, communism is a danger because it paralyzes the defenders and strengthens and heartens the enemies of peace and freedom. It cleaves the nations into fighting groups, disturbs economy by useless quarrels and senseless feuds, and disrupts unity at a time when the highest solidarity alone can safeguard us. In an article that was printed in the New York Times in September of 1943, the paper described Henry George as an, quote, American socialist. So get the sense here of what's going on. And there's confusion about what Henry George actually proposed and what his followers proposed. And you have these staunch individualists such as Schwarzman and Shadorov and others really, denouncing socialism. And now you have the New York Times saying that Henry George was an American socialist. So Otto Dorn, who was the president of the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, contacted the newspaper and asked them to correct this misrepresentation. And in his letter to the Times, he says, Henry George was never a socialist. He believed in individual initiative and enterprise rather than a socialized state, which is a planned economy governed from the top. So let me stop there for just a moment and see if you have any comments or questions for me. I need you to raise your yellow hand if you do, because I don't have everyone's picture on my screen. Okay, not seeing any questions or anything raised by the lecture so far. Let me go on. So what Dorn said is proven over the next number of years by what's happening at the Henry George School. In 1949, the school in Chicago established what they called a commerce and industry division under the direction of a man named John Lawrence Monroe. And Monroe later branched out, establishing what he called the Institute for Economic Inquiry to teach the virtues of, quote, free enterprise. So very much in defense of a reformed version of capitalism or of the free market system. But as Henry George kept reminding people, you don't have a free market if you have monopolies. And particularly if you have land monopolies, you have a very, very skewed sort of system that will never give you the kind of market performance that you would come to expect, or hope to expect. Now, at the end of the Second World War, as Germany and Japan were nearing their defeat in Ontario, the Georgia School of Economic Science published and distributed this pamphlet titled After the War, What, Work or Want? And the authors asked a very fundamental question of their fellow citizens. They wrote, for our workers to have full employment under just conditions, it is not necessary that we adopt any socialistic schemes for state control of industry. We have freed the Negroes from chattel slavery only to find we have still to free Negroes and whites from the industrial slavery consequent on the abuses of taxation and land tenure. It is these abuses which are making men despair of the future of democracy and advocate compulsory state control of all industry. They are seeking to cure the ills resulting from a wrong system of taxation and from state interference by intensifying the very things which cause them. And the sad, unfortunate circumstance is that they are really voices in the wilderness, because events are moving, very much in a direction of increased governmental interference in the economies. If not socialist ideas, those of John Maynard Keynes and other economists who believe very much in a managed economy are coming to the fore. It doesn't mean that the individualist voices are silenced, but they're very much relegated still at this point to the wilderness, at least for a time. The surrender of Germany and Japan brings about the end of the Second World War, but did not bring about peaceful relations between nations. We know this. Stalin orchestrated the westward expansion of the Soviet-style state socialism. The Chinese fought a bloody civil war to achieve some sort of unification. And the victors brought in their own brand of state socialism. And if I went through the list of uprisings, rebellions, and civil wars, beginning with the late 1940s, it would take the rest of the night to cover them. But there was this sense that things had changed after the Second World War. And certainly one of the main things that had changed was the attitude towards colonies and towards imperial empires. There was at least a beginning of recognition that people had a right to self-determination, to their own sovereignty as a people. And certainly, as if you're going to have sovereignty as a people, you have to have some sort of territorial sovereignty to go along with that. So this is part of the intellectual discussion is going on at the end of the Second World War. And obviously socialists and the followers of Henry George have something to say about this. And in their own countries, they're writing about it, they're lecturing about it, they're trying to impact what kind of public policies are going to be adopted. So the one observation I make here is that in countries with relatively stable systems of government, with relatively honest and free elections, and with a commitment to honor the principle of majority rule, the debates began to center on the extent to which government should operate public utilities and otherwise direct economic activity. The masses had endured the deprivations of the Great Depression, and they're now calling upon those who govern to institutionalize prosperity. No more will people be satisfied to go through these big swings in terms of booms to busts, the cycles. So how are these cycles going to be dealt with? How are these political leaders going to achieve some sort of stability? Well, as some of you probably remember, at the end of the Second World War, the voters in Britain decided that the conservatives, they'd had enough of the conservatives for a time, and they brought in the Labour Party to take over British government. And they began to nationalize the basic industries. And other countries were considering doing some of the same thing to soften the impact of capitalism on the people, to introduce new reforms and benefits. The United States had, after the Second World War, passed what became known as the GI Bill of Rights. So a lot more young people were going to get their higher education, get their degrees, get credentials. And that was a big change as well in the post-Second World War period, was that an increased reliance on credentials in order for people to advance in their professions and careers. Now, if you think about it, this is a very difficult time for individualists to have their voices heard. And a lot of progressive legislation is being adopted in countries. There's a significant movement in the Western Europe, in the United States and elsewhere toward what we would today think of as social democracy, and even more to the left. So there's something of a stir that's created in Canada. I'm sorry, not in Canada, but in England, when in 1953, the director of the Agricultural Economics Institute at Oxford, an economist named Karl, decided to take a strong stance and tell the British government and that instead of the kind of agricultural policy of subsidies that they were building, it was that the country would have a much better agricultural sector if it relied on the taxation of land values. In a September 10th article printed in the Financial Times, he challenged conventional agricultural policies, then extended his own argument for the entirety of economic production, meaning if this is good for agriculture, it's going to be good for our economy as a whole. And so in this article, he writes, if we were serious about wanting increased output from British agriculture, instead of playing politics with it, as both parties prefer to do, we should allow the farmer to sell his produce at free world market import prices. Rents also would be allowed to rise to an economic level. The absurdly low rents now charged for many farms do not encourage the farmer to make the fullest use of his land. We would also adopt a land tax, which falls not upon the buildings and improvements, but upon the economic value of the land itself. It is commonplace of economic theory that this form of taxation, and indeed this alone, is no deterrent to production, and indeed encourages farmers and landowners to make full use of their land, to subdivide it where possible and employ more labor. So Karl is, again, while he's a prominent individual, his is a voice very much in the wilderness as well. And I briefly mentioned something about what was going on in Canada, getting ahead of my story a little bit. But a few years later, a Canadian geologist named Ernest Farmer commented on the rising number of students graduating from Canadian universities with degrees in economics, who concluded that solving Canada's economic and social problems called for the adoption of modified socialism. As for what was being taught by university economics professors, Farmer had this to say. In one respect, many university economists have out-Marxed Marx. A large number of economic professors, somewhat distorting the teachings of John Maynard Keynes, have argued that the only way to forfend or avert widespread unemployment is through the continual debasement of the money supply. While this argument is fallacious, patently so to anyone who understands economic fundamentals, it has strongly influenced governmental policies, the more so as it is pleasanter and easier for politicians to spend money than to raise it. So the Western societies are basically embracing, the Keynesian theories, and they're committed to an international economic system that is built on agreements between countries to dampen the level of competition that would occur, and to try to come up with ways that would allow for the production of both guns and butter. This is the analysis of this goes all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, when economists came up with the analysis of what they called production possibilities curve. And that is the balance between producing for the state and producing for consumers. So the use of this phrase, guns versus butter, is a challenge. Okay, in the post-Second World War, and now the beginnings of the Cold War, leading up to the Korean War and every other war that then came after, is how do you establish a strong military and at the same time feed the need that people have for a better social welfare system? Where do you get the money to do this? And there's, obviously all the debates, and the socialists, those with the socialist leanings, are going to argue for progressive taxation, for inheritance taxes, estate taxes, for a value-added tax, all the sorts of taxes on every asset, every activity that occurs. Whereas the followers of Henry George are still arguing the same case, that none of that's necessary. We can raise sufficient rent to cover all of our needs, even those who are not correct needs, with the taxation of rents from all of the sources that produce rents. Fundamental, disagreement. Now, how much are they debating one another? Not much. I've not found, by this time, there's not much direct debate between the socialists and those who come from the single tax environment. There are certainly debates within conferences that are being held, papers that are being presented for and against state socialism, and there's a strong sense in the writings of the single taxers in the 1940s and 50s against communism. People like Frank Shadorov are writing consistently about that throughout the 40s and 50s. Well, getting back just a step in the history, the proponents of Henry George's solutions to the problem of generational poverty, they had been pretty much given up on the political solution after 1928. This is the last campaign of the Commonwealth Land Party, and the two candidates for president and vice president are there. On the right, John C. Lincoln, is an industrialist. I talked about him before. He is the founder of the Lincoln Electric Company, and he was a progressive employer. His company was one of the first to offer its employees profit sharing and incentives to increase productivity. And so Lincoln Electric became extremely profitable and successful, and remains a successful company all the way to this day. Well, Lincoln would become a prominent figure within the Georgist community as the decades went on. Another part of this story is that throughout the first 3 decades of the 20th century, every year or every couple years, single tax enthusiasts would meet in order to give encouragement to one another, report on any signs of progress that occurred, and to just try to discuss strategies that would bring them out of the wilderness and into the public dialogue. This is a photograph from a 1914 conference that was organized under the auspices of the Joseph Fels Fund Commission. And these conferences were suspended during the Second World War, renewed in 1949. But eventually, what happened was that Fels's wife, his widow, was a determined Zionist. And so she began to reallocate the estate of Joseph Fels toward Zionism. One of her objectives was to try to buy land to establish a homeland for Jewish people, not necessarily in Palestine. She was exploring with others the possibility of buying land in South America and other places. And so the funds that had been interjected into the single tax movement by Fels was basically drawn away, and no one else really stepped up with that kind of wealth. But John C. Lincoln, he brought a good deal of his own personal fortune into the movement beginning in the 1920s. by the Second World War, with the Henry George School expanding, many of its leading male figures were in the military. So the school brought a woman named Margaret Bateman from Montreal to take over as director of the school in New York. And despite the war, the extensions and affiliate programs opened in many cities across the country. The Henry George School in New York acquired a new headquarters because of increased enrollment. And in her regular report on school matters, she informed supporters, this was 1943, I believe. She said, "This spring has brought new encouragement, the highest enrollment in the New York school since pre-war days. This indicates a growing desire to study world problems. On Wednesday, April 10th, the school was operating almost at capacity. One class was so large that it was transferred to the auditorium and will be divided into 3 classes to facilitate intimate discussion." So, although the political influence of single taxers was falling, there was a great deal of encouragement coming out of the effort through education, through public education. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the nations occupying the European continent were also, again, as I said, beginning to engage in new social, economic, and political experiments. And citizens not subject to domination under the reach of the Soviet Union were still demanding change. And they demanded what is best called social democracy, or, in some sense, democratic socialism. But the process would be democratic. Citizens would have the opportunity to make a choice, to vote for candidates who called for nationalization of the land, nationalization of industry, progressive income tax, progressive estate taxes, limits on corporate activities, etc. In at least one nation, Denmark, social democracy had already had a long history of advocacy. And a good deal of that, beginning with the late 19th century, occurred because Danish progressives embraced Henry George's ideas. From the early part of the century on, there was a Danish social democratic party that endorsed the collection of land values for public purposes. And in the 1920s, the Danes formed the Danish Justice Party, and the taxation of land values was made central to the party's platform. So, at least in Denmark, there's now new encouragement that the educational process will find supporters who will then become political. And so Denmark is, at this point in time, looked at as a leading what you call a vanguard in the resurgence of political activity. At the 1952 International Conference on Land Value Taxation and Free Trade, which was held in Denmark, the Danish geologist named Dan Bjorner reported on the situation in Denmark, but it also reveals much about what was going on elsewhere as well. And I just pulled this one statement out that puts it into a sense of a reality check. In other words, people were looking to Denmark as playing the leading role to really bring single tax ideas back to the forefront. And he basically gave them a bit of a reality check. He says, "In recent years, there has been no legislation on the lines of our ideas. Indeed, on the question of free trade, it has gone directly against us. But there is the old saying that is always darkest before dawn. Today, land value taxation and free trade are in daily debate all over the country." So there's pushback, but the Justice Party is hanging in there, for at least for a while. A lot happened in Denmark to change the situation. Following the Second World War, the country adopted a new constitution. It created a single chamber government. And in the election of September 1953, the Justice Party lost 3 of the 9 seats that it held. By 1960, the party lost all of its seats in parliament. It subsequently regained them, but finally lost their final 5 seats in 1982. And just to give you a perspective, in 1982, the socialists won 85 out of the 90 seats. So there's discussion about Henry George's ideas about single tax, land value taxation, but the socialists are basically in control. And if they have any real interest in the land question and solving the land question, it's relegated well below the other priorities that they have politically. Let me stop again. You've been very patiently listening. Any comments, observations, or questions that you have? Go back.
Let me unmute myself first.
You're unmuted. I can hear you.
Okay, good. I've been thinking quite a bit about not only your recent part of your presentation, but back to the beginning when you were talking about Chodorov and Schwartzman, who were very conservative. And that may be due to the fact that they came out of the communist dominated alternative worldwide.
Well, Chodorov didn't. Chodorov was born in New York.
Yeah,
you know,
but they were very strong individualists.
Yes, yeah. And they would use that term, not conservative. They would call themselves individualists. That they were part of the individualist remnant that pre-libertarian libertarians.
Yeah. Well, what I'm pondering is that the concept of socialism, which is such a bugaboo even today for many people in our society, is really superseded since we've had certain modern economic thought. And I'm thinking mainly of Paul Samuelson, who was the originator of the idea of a public good as opposed to a private good. And his thinking, and I think that's one of the reasons he won the Nobel Prize. He argued that a public good is both non-rival and non-exclusive, whereas a private good is the opposite. And when Henry George was alive, the idea of public good was not understood. And now that we do understand those dimensions of our productivity, social productivity, it kind of obviates the concept of socialism as it was earlier thought. So I'm wondering whether, in fact, today, if we were to adopt wider use of the idea of public good, we might be able to attract more of the socialists that seem to be a rival to the Georgists. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I think, yeah, my view is that both those on the left and those who are individualists believe in democracy, believe in decisions reached by a majority of the people. And so there's this, it's back to a state of, let's argue on the basis of facts, analysis, and logic. and let people decide how much government we want. And maybe we'll be wrong, but at least in democracy, if we're wrong, we can change our minds and we can follow another path. Now, the specific question that you raise about those of us who embrace Henry George's ideals, working with or convincing those who are lean towards socialism that that there is a distinction between public and private goods that needs to be respected. I think many of us have been trying to do that, all along. And for some people, it has an impact. Some of us are hardliners either way. There are hardline libertarians and there are hardline socialists and progressives. And then there are most of us who are probably more willing to listen and accept the prospect that we might not know it all. So I guess, Bill, the answer, my answer is we should continue to try, and that's what, that's why I developed this course, hoping that it would attract people who already had strong feelings in favor of socialism, so that they would have a more extensive exposure to this debate that went on from the time that Marx and Henry George were alive.
Well, the idea of public good and private good, that distinction is less a matter of ideology than it is simply a matter of empirical research. Where no one's arguing about the political dimension in favor of democracy. What we're talking about is the economic distinctions here. And socialism is much more an economic paradigm than it is a political paradigm.
Well, that is an assessment that I would say isn't quite universally held. So
you may be right.
I mean, Bill, you are a man of reason and logic who is moved by facts, but unfortunately, not everyone is. Many of us look at how many people are aligned with a political party because their parents were aligned with that political party, and hold those ideologies, throughout their lives without any serious study of what it even means. Michael.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned earlier in Britain about the Conservatives were driven out after the last World War, even though they was at a high standing with Churchill, etc. And the Labour movement arose because it thought that's its way forward, and that's remained the struggle ever since. It's a Labour Conservative, and now you can't really tell the difference because they're all aiming for their own control for their own purposes, and no one is really pursuing a real. And what I put down here, we should be looking for and wide as possible, an international understanding of the rules of land tenure and its obligations. Now, if we were to look for that, and I think Bill Batt more or less was looking at that, if we look at the evidence, we would bypass all these social isms which seem to get in the way, and they became entrenched. I mean, I personally have voted for all the different parties at one time or other, and it's difficult to decide at the time. You sort of toss a coin almost and hope for the best, and etc. So, and what I'm looking for is an international understanding, a worldwide international understanding of the rules that we need to put in place in individual democracies or any constitution, of the rules of the tenure of the land, etc., 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 and the obligations accruing to it. If you do that, it's job done, as it were. But you've got to do that very accurately and honestly, and people have to go along with a sense of a sense of justice that binds them all, you know.
Well, we have some of that evidence in the international debate. Certainly, I mean, there's a good deal of activity and discussion within the confines of the United Nations, and within the Georgist movement, there's been a presence at the United Nations among the NGOs, and several of our members have had good experience with talking to people at the UN, getting them to listen and pay attention to these issues. The World Bank, of all places, all entities, has had a good deal of analysis done about the land question and land monopoly. And then think back of probably one of the most important statements or pieces of law written internationally is the law of the sea treaty. Not fully embraced by all countries. The United States, pressured by its corporate interest, reluctant to adhere to, enforce, sign on to the law of the sea treaty, but it's there, in my view, as a basis for further progress and discussion. So I guess that means I'm hopeful, not quite yet optimistic, that what you're looking for is already underway, and hopefully more and more as it rises out of the academic arena and into the political arena, there'll be far more discussion about it. And it seems to me that the path that's taking is based on the recognition that we're destroying the planet by the intense amount of CO2 that's coming into the atmosphere. And something dramatic has to be done. Hopefully, the perspectives that we believe are critical to the solution will rise to a level of part of the political agenda. Tom, did you want to say something further, Michael?
Just one point. It's a cliche or a slogan, really, but it says, we've always asked here in England, how does a nation change its mind? How can it adopt honest policies that are obviously true? And it seems to be a struggle against some form of defect in human, I don't know, human.
Well, it's often said that we don't choose the right solution until we've tried all the others.
It will happen. We have to reach rock bottom before we perhaps do anything, and then find it's too late.
Yeah, that unfortunately, just with the limited case of adopting land value taxation in local communities, is too often the case. That only when those community leaders get desperate do they finally come around to accepting the idea of, well, we need to change how we raise our revenue and look to the land as an appropriate source of revenue instead of taxing everyone's productive activity. So we still have a long way to go in terms of public education and education of our leaders. And like I say, I'm still hopeful. Tom.
Yes, thank you. So I think Bill opened up a really interesting question, and I think this is something that's not well appreciated, and I think it is beneficial as a framework, because the beginning in the late 19th century, the field of economics with Alfred Marshall and William Stanley Jevons and all these guys, and the marginalist revolution and Pareto, they tried to turn economics into a discipline similar to a social science discipline or a science discipline similar to physics. And that's why they had to do that because they wanted to use math. They wanted to use algebra. They wanted to use the equilibrium of Newtonian physics. Well, we know Newtonian physics was wrong, essentially, even though, obviously it doesn't detract from Newton's brilliance. But the point being that everything that we're talking about is political economy, and it's not just politics, it's not just economics, it's also the social issues as well, and the social contract with which everybody, this is sort of how John Locke and a lot of the 18th century Enlightenment figures, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, wrote extensively about the social contract, because the way a society agrees to relate to each other, and you talked about this in your class on cooperative individualism, the way that people see themselves within the context of society and society views itself has a huge impact on the decisions they make and the type of activity that they engage in, and who they elect, and what size of the welfare state that they will engage in. So I think it's a good point to make that issue of it's political economy and the social contract. Everything that we're talking, there's nothing that we're talking about could be possibly done or even remotely proven by just an economic argument, because economics itself, you can't. You talked about natural experiments, can never be done. You can't. It's not like physics where you can define the rules of universal physical properties and then extrapolate that with experiments.
One of the challenges, in my view, that the academic community has is to reinvigorate interdisciplinary analysis. The process that you actually described, the breakdown of, remember, political economy was a subset of moral philosophy.
Right.
So we, I was fortunate that I dropped out of a degree program toward a degree in economics, a master's degree in economics, and I changed my degree program to liberal arts because it was interdisciplinary. I was able to take courses at Temple University in every department. So, but there was no integration of those departments back to a school of integrated social science. So the economics department, the sociology department, the political science department, the history department, they all had their own hierarchy. They all had their own jargon and language that made it difficult for them to work with one another. But there's a fair amount of evidence that is recognized now, and it's changing. There are at least some annual interdisciplinary conferences that occur that people from all the different social sciences attend to try to learn from one another. Someone else might know more about how well that's going.
Actually, can I just mention that there's a great organization called Evonomics, a combination of evolution and economics. So Evonomics, it's also called the New Economics. It's Josh Ryan Collins, you probably know him.
Yeah, I know.
And 5 Nobel laureates, Robert Schiller, Stiglitz, Krugman, and a bunch of others are advocates of this, and I would highly recommend you look it up. And it's interdisciplinary, exactly what you're talking about. And of course, the recognition goes beyond just certain movements. It's actually headquartered out of the University of Oxford, so that has a lot of weight in and of itself. But five Nobel Prizes have been awarded since 2002 to behavioral economists. So including, Daniel Kahneman and Robert Schiller and Richard Thaler and others.
Those are all signs of not only hope, but optimism as well, that maybe, people are getting closer to examining the real causes of our problems, and we'll be coming back to political economy as a method of analysis. Joe.
One quick question. What was the source of Colin Clark's remarks?
I don't remember, to tell you the truth. I probably have it in my notes somewhere, but I didn't make note of it on the screen.
Yeah, no, I'd like to follow that up. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
thank you.
Okay. Send me an email so I don't forget, and maybe I'll be able to find it for you. I'm
Thank
sure
you.
I have it. I have it on my computer somewhere. So getting back to our story, unless anyone else has one more comment you'd like to make. from the time that Henry George was traveling in Europe, there were small groups of his converts that were working in other countries, France and Belgium. The translations of Henry George's books ignited a renewed interest in the physiocratic writings of Quesnay and Turgot and Dupont. And so there was a renewed academic interest in going back and studying the source of these ideas, in France in particular, but also in Belgium. A land reform league was organized in Paris in 1927 with this fellow, Sam Mayer, as its head. Mayer unfortunately died in 1945 while he was imprisoned at one of the Nazi camps. I think it was Auschwitz. And so, again, the Second World War, as with the First World War, there were leading personalities who were lost to the campaign. At the 1949 International Conference, two Europeans, A. Dodd Bancel and Marcel Coudvrien, I'm not sure about my pronunciation of those last names, they reported on the situation in France and Belgium. They offered a number of revealing observations regarding the strategies of the communists and the socialists. And Bancel wrote in his report, the communists in France are principally occupied with sabotaging the Marshall Plan and destroying the public economy in order to create discontent and thus gain the chance to capture political power and rule the country on Russian lines. Most of the socialists are in agreement with them in the matter of nationalizing large private undertakings to the undoing of public finance and the workers whom they mistakenly believe they are benefiting. The Belgians, he goes on to say, the Belgians cannot be blamed in quite the same way. After investigating results in France, they've abandoned the idea of nationalizing the coal mines. The socialists in their National Congress of 1925 actually voted by a show of hands for a tax of 1% on the unimproved value of land. But this was merely paying lip service to Georgist ideas. You might recall that what's going on in Europe all at the same time is the beginnings of the European Union. So you have, the recognition, for example, that there has to be some kind of European development of natural resources. So it was trying to remember the French economist who led the organization of the iron ore and coal system.
Talking about Schumann?
No, but it'll come to me and potentially come to me, Bill.
Sounds like Robert Schumann.
I don't think it was Schumann that I'm talking
Okay.
about. But anyway, the whole point is that, again, the single taxers, they're relevant, but events are moving against them in terms of unification of the economic system on the European continent. The stress that's being imposed on the Western democracies, because there's within those countries there's strong socialist and communist movements, and as Bancel said, that in France the communists were trying to get people, disrupt the system so that people would be so discontented that they would want to overthrow the government. In Greece, there was a Greek named Pavlos Giannoulia, who was the Greek diplomat who served in Vienna until 1939, when he left Austria for Switzerland. And he was a longtime proponent of Henry George's political economy. He wrote from time to time as a contributing writer for Land and Liberty. In 1942, while he was in Switzerland, he had productive discussions with the Greek prime minister, who expressed a real interest in bringing about Georgist reforms to Greece. And this was Emmanuel Toudaris, was the prime minister of Greece in exile in Egypt from 41 until 1944. Henry George's doctrines really found a lot of support, however, in Spain. Reportedly, after Progress and Poverty was first translated from English into French and then from the French into Spanish. And public interest in Spain increased after Joseph Fels organized an international conference there in 1913 in Ronda. And the Spanish movement grew until the Spanish Civil War. An attorney and professor of economics named Antonio Alonso was using Henry George's works as the text for his teaching at the University of Salamanca. And when the fascists gained power, he was falsely accused of treason and was arrested. And although he was cleared of the charges, investigation into his teaching of Henry George's doctrines were challenged as anti-patriotic and anarchistic. So, the Spanish single taxers had a very hard time. In fact, Alonso was initially sentenced to death. I just found this image from the Spanish Civil War that kind of gives you a sense of the desperation of some of what was going on there. So he was prevented from returning to his university, and all of his possessions were confiscated, and he was put into prison. He served 6 years. He wasn't executed, but I haven't been able to find out what happened to him afterward. So he was pulled out of the single tax movement in Spain because of of Franco and the Spanish Civil War. In 1949, another Spanish Georgist reported on the situation there as follows. He says, "Our numbers are reduced to a tenth of what they were, and only a handful of self-denying, distinguished, and brave fighters for our ideal stand firm, defending themselves as best they can and attacking the wicked world around them with what little strength they have, without hope, but with noble unselfishness, the fruit of their faith in things true." And it just struck me as a statement that could have been made about what was happening on the behalf of single tax movement in almost every country. And then there's also the continuing existence of some interest among the Chinese. So during the Second World War, the president of the Chinese National Academy, Dr. Lai Yuling, came to the United States, and on several occasions he met with the director and trustees at the Henry George School in New York. During his 1942 visit, the director, Margaret Bateman, actually proposed that a Henry George School be established in China after the war. And as you know from history, as events unfolded, the opportunity was lost to civil war and the abandonment of mainland China to the communists. But it didn't mean that Henry George's ideas died, because we know what happened with regard to land reform in Taiwan, which was somewhat influenced by the awareness among Chiang Kai-shek's people that Henry George's ideas were relevant to creating a successful society on Taiwan. And so that's another story altogether. But my whole point is, the ideas never die. They always find a way to enter into the debate. We even have, some history of Einstein weighing in on this debate between the socialists and the single taxers. As his status rose among the history's great intellectuals, an American proponent of Henry George's principles wrote to him in 1931, and he replied that, quote, he says he had read, quote, the largest part of Progress and Poverty, but he was unconvinced that George's remedy would solve the problems George had identified. Some years earlier, in fact, he had concluded that a socialist society offered the best opportunity for greater justice. So here's someone not trained in economics, of course, but certainly, a deep thinker about the problems of human condition. He's evaluated Henry George's ideas against those of Marx, and he weighs in behalf of socialism. In 1934, Anna DeMille, Henry George's daughter, wrote to Einstein, and he confirmed again that he had read Progress and Poverty. But he did say this about Henry George as a person. I don't know if he would have said the same thing about Marx or not, but he wrote, "Men like Henry George are rare, unfortunately. One cannot imagine a more beautiful combination of intellectual keenness, artistic form, and fervent love of justice. Every line is written as if for our generation. The spreading of these works is a really deserving cause, for our generation especially has many and important things to learn from Henry George." Unfortunately, he didn't go on to explain what he thought those things were. And going back, it was 1918 when he first argued his case for a socialist economy, and he resurrected those ideas again in 1949. And in 49, he had to say this: "The individual is able to think, feel, strive, and work by himself, but he depends so much upon society. His life is made possible through the labor and the accomplishments of the many millions, past and present, who are all hidden behind the word society." And I have 3 more quotes from this book because I thought what he had to say was extremely important. "The economic anarchy of capitalist society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of the evil. We see before us a huge community of producers, the members of which are unceasingly striving to deprive each other of the fruits of their collective labor, not by force, but on the whole in faithful compliance with legally established rules. Private capital tends to become concentrated in few hands, partly because of competition among the capitalists, and partly because technological development and the increasing division of labor encourage the formation of larger units of production at the expense of smaller ones. The result of these developments is an oligarchy of private capital, the enormous power of which cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave ills, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy, which adjusts production to the needs of the community, would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. And finally, the education of the individual, in addition to promoting his own innate abilities, would attempt to develop in him a sense of responsibility for his fellow men in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. And as I read those words and read what Einstein had to say, it just kept coming back to me that these are all valid criticisms of the direction that our existing social and economic system has taken, up to this very moment. You could practically have written those words, in 2021. Anyone else have a reaction similar to mine or different to mine of Einstein's view on what socialism would mean? And again, he's talking about democratic socialism and a system designed to serve the needs of people.
Take that, Margaret Thatcher.
Perfect, Bill. Yeah, I mean, getting back to what I said earlier in this course, the people that are thoughtful are struggling to find the right balance between property rights and human rights. What is the right role of the rule of law in this struggle? And so it's an ever evolving debate that's occurring. And and as I finish up in here, in the next 20 slides or so, if I get to them all, I'll try to show you that there's a sense that there is a possibility of those of us who embrace the core arguments of Henry George working with and alongside those who embrace to some extent the ideals that Marx presented in his writings and that socialists continue to argue for today. Now, so think about our recent history. As the 50s came and went, so did the outward support of socialism, because it was basically thrown in. All socialist ideas were thrown in with the state socialism of Russia and its despotic regime. And so in the United States, at least, what we see is a rise of what we call liberalism. And it took on most of the issues around which socialists had formed an activist vanguard. The key thing that I see in what we called social liberalism was that those on the far left and the far right were basically pretty much ignored, and that moderates on the left and moderates on the right worked together to find consensus over public policies that would move the agenda forward. And so this is a period, at least in the United States, where there's compromise in order to get things done. Bob Clancy is shown here. He came to be the director of the Henry George School in New York in 1955. He had been in the military, and so he came back from the Second World War, began teaching again, and eventually took over as director of the school. And in 1955, in the 50s, he makes this observation about where the Henry George community was. He says, for one reason or another, Henry George is pushed out of sight, but he just refuses to stay pushed. Every so often, there's a flurry of interest in Henry George, a spate of articles in the press, a mention or two in halls of learning and legislation, but it hasn't yet taken hold. When I behold the marvelous performance of our teaching and propagating on the one hand, and the endless involvements of our deliberations in our councils on the other, I sometimes see ourselves as playing a role not unlike that of the ancient Greeks or the modern French. They were the teachers of mankind, but couldn't organize a government. They thought too much. Their ideas, however, gave form and direction to others who had the necessary organizing skills. This is not a bad role to play. It is a great role. And so what he's looking for is the educational process to attract new individuals who are not thoroughly versed or dedicated to Henry George's ideas, but will take them and run with them in their own way. So by the 1960s, what debates that were occurring between the followers of George and Marx were likely occurred in one of the classrooms scattered around the world where we're teaching Henry George. Socialist speakers were invited in. Just to give you an idea of the progress in terms of education, in 1965, about 1,300 people completed courses at the New York School. Another 300 completed correspondence courses. They had a speakers bureau that filled 55 engagements in the New York region, and about 125,000 people were reported to have completed the school's basic course in political economy since the beginning of its establishment in 1932. So there's 125,000 people, at least, most of whom are probably still alive by the 50s, who were aware of Henry George's contribution to some extent. But by the 1970s, this period of educational outreach was in the decline. And my feeling of why this occurred is pretty straightforward. Again, after the Second World War, it's an environment where credentials become increasingly important for employment advancement. The Henry George schools could not issue a degree. And so in the United States, at least, there was a vast increase in the number of state colleges where people could get a bachelor's or advanced degree relatively inexpensively. There was the GI Bill of Rights that provided benefits to veterans to do this. And where those weren't accessible, city after city, region after region was opening up what they call community colleges, two-year colleges that would issue an associate's degree. So one by one, the various Henry George schools began to lose students, lose financing, and eventually started to shut down. And there was one reason for that, was that when John C. Lincoln died, the foundation that was created upon his death gradually reduced the amount of financial support it was giving to the Henry George schools. And by 1971, they had decided to withdraw financial support altogether, and they supported the establishment of the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, which took over advocacy of studying land issues and land policy issues, but with a very reduced emphasis on Henry George and Henry George's ideas. And so because the schools were shutting down, the feeder system to keep the movement reasonably alive was also shutting down. And so the conferences year after year that were being held both in the United States and internationally were losing attendance. So instead of 300 people, by the 70s, maybe 150 people. And even today now, there's very little opportunity to get more than 60 or 70 people to attend a conference of the Council of Georgist Organizations. So it's a problem of attrition and circumstances that had brought the movement to this point. There are still thousands of people scattered around the world today who are convinced that Henry George's proposed solutions are the most significant. And after decades of ideological bias against their proposals based on Marx, there's a renewed examination of interest, not just for Marx, but in systemic reforms that fall into the general definition of socialism. We know, for example, in the United States, the word socialism, while it gets denounced by those on the right, the conservatives, there's a growing number of Americans who very much support what Bernie Sanders has had to say about the intervention, the necessary for government to take a much stronger role in the economy and in our society. I have to say this, though. I have scoured Bernie Sanders' writings to the extent they're available, and I've never found one mention by him of Henry George or the idea of collecting rent for public revenue. Maybe there is something, and maybe someday, before too long, someone will get his attention to the idea. However, one of the strongest voices today in support of democratic socialism is the economics professor Richard Wolff, and he has studied Henry George as well as Karl Marx. Back in 2016, he was a guest on the Henry George School's program Smart Talk, and Andrew Mazzoni, the president of the school at the time, interviewed him, and he had recently, Wolff had recently retired from teaching neoclassical economics at the University of Massachusetts, and he had come to become a lecturer at the New School in New York City. So he said he now finally felt free to express himself without reservation to support his own view that the capitalist system had to be supplanted by a system devoted to socialist principles and what he called cooperative enterprise. And during this interview with Andrew Mazzoni, he began to talk about the possibility of working together. He made the argument that there needed to be a fund that could come out of the rent of nature that would be channeled to all workers, even to all members of society. So he's talking about the universal basic income in that interview. And this would permit workers to bring financial resources to the establishment of cooperative enterprises. And so here's a word for word transcript of what he had to say during that interview. I think that I would love to have an alliance between Georges and us. I think your idea of using the ground rent notion, the notion that as societies grow and develop, the accident that they compete for pieces of land that are limited while the population grows, and that therefore deliver huge portions of the national wealth to the people who have done absolutely nothing to create the land that they sat on, other than control the right to exclude others as societies, that would give us the funds. And indeed, there are other ways of collecting the funds to enable there to be a cooperative sector of our economy. And so there's that potential. It's 8:02, so there are a few more slides here, but I'm really going to end now. This quote from Richard Wolff is worth finishing up with. He said, the demands for concrete alternatives to capitalism and the critiques of classical socialism and communism from the left have coalesced into renewed interest in and new conceptions of cooperative enterprises. Major enterprise decisions that are no longer to be monopolized by the major shareholders and the boards of directors those shareholders select. That norm in capitalist corporations is to be abandoned. Instead, workplaces, enterprises are to be democratized. Workers are to become collectively their own board of directors in fully cooperative enterprises. They would decide what, how, and where to produce, and they would distribute the surpluses or profits generated in and by their enterprise. And so that's where we are in this debate between the followers of Henry George and Karl Marx, as I see it today. There's opportunity for us to work together. And I think someone like Richard Wolff, if his ideas become dominant within the left thinking, that there's more opportunity for the individualist perspective to have some impact. So that's where I think we are. I'll open it up now for some comment, discussion, for as long as you'd like to stay together.
Ed, do you want to keep going, or do you think we could meet again next week to have a big debate over whatever was presented? It's a lot of dense material. I don't know.
That's a great idea. By a show of hands, how many would like to get, and by being a show of hands, use your reactions thing to put up your thumb, that thumbs up thing, about getting together next week for an open discussion. And that would get a chance for a lot more people to participate as well.
Yep, there's 6. I see a lot of people. Yep, already.
Where's that?
Yep.
Where's
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll do that, and we'll invite some others to join us. So we'll have a real opportunity to think about what I went over so far in the course and your reaction to it. Bill, did you want to say anything final before we break up?
Yeah, I think just the one thing that, if I recall, I don't remember the exact date, volume 3 of Marx's Capital was only translated somewhat later in the 20th century. And most Marxists are not familiar with it at all.
Correct. Yeah, I made that point earlier in the course.
That's very true. Michael Hudson always mentioned that.
and followers of Henry George kept reminding socialists and Marxists, you better read, volume 3 before we have a conversation. Read volume 3, learn what Marx really wanted to say.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a last comment before we break up tonight?
Wynn has her hand up.
Yeah. I've gotten interested in Scott Nearing's writings from the teens, basically, and then he became increasingly socialist, and I'm less interested in that period. But it's led me to wonder about the people who seem to be non-Marxist socialists, or at least would never mention Marx. And I know that he eventually went to the Communist Party, and then they threw him out. But he sounded like a Georgist to me in the years that he was in Arden and a couple of years thereafter.
Yeah, my one comment about that, Wynn, is that it's not unusual. There were many people who adhered, who embraced Henry George's ideas, but I think because of the world's circumstances, that they saw that it was unlikely that George's prescription for solutions would be enacted. And so what was the next best thing to do? Because, I mean, what's the potential for change? As opposed to the ideal change. It's like the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Okay.
And maybe, without having read Nearing's work very thoroughly, maybe he explains himself, but I think Einstein's observations are right along the same lines. He may reading Progress and Poverty and reading Henry George, he may have said this is a beautiful view of a possible future, but
Yeah.
and the
Okay.
but can be pretty dominating.
Yeah.
Wayne, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, in regard to the volume 3 of Marxist Capital, I have been told years ago by some other Georges, I forget exactly who, that was probably the writing about collecting ground rents was probably came more out of Frederick Engels than of Marx himself. Engels kind of may have been the work of Engels. Could you comment on that?
Well, here again, you got to put yourself on mute, Wayne. If we had access to the original handwritten manuscript of volume 3 of Capital against the final printed version as put together by Engels, we would know. And I'm sure that manuscript is somewhere, but I've never seen any kind of analysis of what was the direct influence of Engels over what was written in the 3rd volume. That's the best answer I can give you. Maybe someone else, has come across that, but I have not.
Well, my introduction is written by Ernest Mandel to volume 3, and I'll take a look and see whether, in fact.
Okay, and next week, Bill, you can enlighten us.
I will try.
So with that, I'll thank everybody for joining me for this entire course, and I look forward to a robust discussion next week. And those of you who have patiently sat there and listened to us, rant on, that you'll join us in discussion. So till then, all be well.
Thanks, Ed.